Join us now for Education Matters, a weekly look at the real people and real stories in education across North Carolina.
Welcome to Education Matters, presented by the Public School Forum of North Carolina. I'm Keith Poston. On May 16th last year, nearly 20,000 North Carolina teachers descended on Raleigh for a march and rally outside the North Carolina General Assembly, asking for more support for public schools and respect for the teaching profession. Teachers are planning another rally on May 1 this year, asking the General Assembly to fully fund public education. This week, we're joined by Mark Jewell, president of the North Carolina Association of Educators, that organized these marches to discuss what teachers hope to accomplish this year. Then we're going to be joined by two leading journalists to talk about the march, education policy, state budget, and much more. Before we tackle our main topics, we open with Edlines, our quick scan of education headlines across North Carolina and the U.S. Could we be ready to see a replay of the power struggle between State Superintendent Mark Johnson and the State Board of Education? A bill introduced last week in the North Carolina House, House Bill 639, would transfer more power to the superintendent from the board. This bill enables the superintendent to establish his own general counsel division within DPI that would provide legal services on an as-needed basis to support the state board. The bill eliminates two key positions that currently support them, the Legislative and Community Affairs Director, a position held currently by Cecilia Holden, and the state's board staff attorney position held by Eric Snyder. The state's Charter Advisory Board last week recommended the approval of a new 2,000-seat charter school in Wake County that would be run by a Charter One, a large for-profit charter management company led by Arizona businessman Glenn Way. Way has made millions of dollars building, selling, and leasing properties to the charter schools he runs. Here in North Carolina, taxpayer-funded management fees paid to Way's company would be up to $3 million annually. Finally, a big congratulations to Moore County Elementary School teacher Mariah Morris, who was named the 2019 Burroughs Welcome Fund North Carolina Teacher of the Year. Morris is an original North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program alum from UNC Chapel Hill and wants to focus on making STEM education more accessible to underserved students. Remember, you can visit the Public School Forum's website at ncforum.org, click on Education Matters, and read more about each of these headlines as well as other topics we cover each week. As I said at the top of the show, North Carolina teachers are planning another march and rally in 2 weeks right here in the state capitol, and the head of the state's largest teacher group, NCAE, that is organizing the march is with us today. Mark Jewell, yes. President, welcome back to Education Matters.
It is great to be here, Keith, and thank you for always reaching out to NCAE. It's an honor to be here.
All right, well, first on a personal, happy birthday. I think you celebrated a birthday this week, yes. So we're just getting younger and better every week.
We are. It's good to be here.
All right, well, Mark, let's jump right in. Last year, teachers marched in record numbers in Raleigh. I mean, not just on the issue of pay, but really more to highlight the fact that our classrooms were under-resourced. I guess, first of all, has anything changed from last year to this year in terms of sort of investments that you were looking for at you and the teachers that came?
Right. Well, first of all, we want to make sure that folks know that this is just more than a teacher rally. We are making sure that our cafeteria workers, our bus drivers, our lowest paid workers out there are joining with us, our community members, our parents, anyone who supports public education. And we have seen some changes since last year on May 16th. Obviously, May 16th was about really making sure that we found and elected public education policymakers on November the 6th. And we did that. We were able to change some of the faces out there that had been putting forth bad policy. So we changed some policymakers. So now, as we move forward into this general session, we need to change some policy. So this is why we're coming forth with a May 1 day of action. Again, we have great support from our school districts out there. We expect another big turnout. And we have 5 key priorities, obviously, that most folks are well aware of.
Yeah, let's talk about those. I want to talk about your priorities, and then I do want to get back to the issue of changing officials, because I think that has at least been one of the flashpoints among us. So let's talk about what the sort of why teachers are coming.
Yes, we're coming here obviously because you can't talk about May 1st or May 16th last year without talking about what happened in the summer of 2013 when we had major cuts to public education, basically centered around we had corporate tax breaks and tax breaks from millionaires that cost the districts about $3 billion a year in public school funding. So it has taken its toll over those 6 years. This is the reason that we haven't had a textbook adoption in 15 years. There's a reason that we have a huge teacher shortage in North Carolina. There's a reason that we don't have school nurses and social workers now. There's a huge funding issue. We need to make sure that that is a priority going forward. And now we have Republicans and Democrats actually talking about these issues, about working together to make sure that we can have investments in our public schools.
Well, you mentioned Republicans and Democrats both talking about it. Since this was announced, the new rally on May the 1st, there's been some criticism. Senator Phil Berger has been very vocal, and in the last couple of weeks, there's been charges that NCA is just to elect Democrats. This is a partisan ploy using teachers as pawns to get Republicans out of office. What's your response to that?
I always tell people when I hear that type of rhetoric, I said, listen, public education is supposed to be nonpartisan. Democrats and Republicans alike know that strong schools are good for the community. This is not a Democratic march. It is not a Republican march. It's a march for North Carolina. It's a march for North Carolina's future. Last year when we had 30,000 folks show up, those were Democrats and Republicans and unaffiliated. Those were pro-business, those were pro-government, they were community supporters, and they do not like what's happened to North Carolina public education over the past 6 years.
Right. Let me ask you, one of the things that I think some people were surprised when they read sort of your list of priorities for this march was the expansion of Medicaid.
Right.
Why does a teachers organization, or why would teachers make expanding Medicaid a priority?
Yes, the Medicaid was actually a piece of our component last year. We wanted to elevate it this year because we can't teach kids when they're coming to school sick. We have about 25% of our population is in extreme poverty. We know that when kids come and they're unhealthy, they don't get health insurance, and their parents are sick, that affects their learning. And this is something that Republican states have already done. It's bringing dollars and resources into North Carolina public schools. Right now, we're sending them to the other states so that they can have health care, and it's a moral issue for us.
What you mentioned, I mean, this is connected to sort of health care. You mentioned part of the funding for public schools does go fund nurses and counselors and psychiatrists. We've talked about this on the show before, but you hear it from teachers. I mean, what does it look like out in the across the state?
Well, real quickly, we're 50th in the nation in how we fund our social and emotional health of our students right now. When I talk to school nurses, they're telling me, Mark, it's getting really scary out there. The chronic illnesses that kids are coming with now, and there's no medical support there. Teachers are rising up and doing the best they can, but it's a crisis and a disaster that's waiting to happen if we don't address and have funding for our school nurses, our psychologists, our social workers, and counselors.
Another priority, and has also been of a lot of debate, also seems to be something that you're also seeing Republicans, some at least, support, is the restoration of pay for achieving a master's degree. Teachers, up until just a few years ago, got a pay bump if they had achieved a master's degree, and that was eliminated. Why do you think that's important?
Yeah, well, it's one of the reasons that brought me here back in 1997, because of that addition of the salary supplement for master's degree pay. Most states pay for it. 33 states require it as part of keeping their licensure. It's a huge recruitment tool. And right now, folks are going to our border states, to South Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee, because they can go to those states and get at least a 10% increase because they're being rewarded for their professional development at a high quality college and university. It needs to be put back. We hear Republicans putting forth bills, working with Democrats, and it's a huge recruitment tool. We have about 1,500 positions that remain vacant all year. So we have got to make sure that we invest in educator and educator pay.
Right. I mentioned the criticism. The other thing that has been criticized, besides sort of the partisan nature, I've heard this from State Superintendent Johnson. We've certainly heard it from Senate leadership, is that this is really going to be an inconvenience for parents because it's an unplanned. A lot of schools, we're now what? How many districts have announced closures?
Yes, as of last night, we have 13 districts. That's probably around 40% of our student population right now. We champion these school districts that stood up and said, listen, let's trade this for an optional day. We realize it may be a day of disruption, but our schools have been disrupted by the policies of 2013. Our schools are starving, and they have taken their toll on our children.
So you're, as far as the idea of it being like this is worth, so I guess you're saying it's a disruption.
It is.
It could be inconvenient, but from your perspective, it's necessary.
Right. Big change has happened through disruption in America, and we believe that it is our right to stand up and advocate on behalf of our students, and we make no apologies for that. Coming on a Saturday would do no good. The General Assembly sets their schedule. Coming at the end of the session when decisions are already made would be no good. We are at critical mass right now, and we have to address resources for our students.
Right. All right. Let me. One of the other. I mean, it does seem like there was some of the same criticisms were leveled last year for the march. There's been some unusual ones, maybe some different ones. I think we have an image. Where's your? We've got a logo that you've set for your May the 1st. I think we can pull that up on the screen of a raised fist. Suggestions that it's some kind of Marxist communist plot. I mean, I have to ask. I mean, sort of, what was your reaction when you first heard that somehow that this was
Yeah. What we'll say for that is that is deeply offensive. NCAE has had decades of being a social justice and civil rights organization, and that symbol and the raised fist has always shown unity and solidarity for all folks. And those type of scare tactics have been used in the past to try to squelch movements of progress. So we stand proudly for our students and our educators.
All right, last question for you. May 1st gets here, you have a turnout. What do you hope to accomplish? What will be your sort of
Right,
top?
you know, we would like to see those 5 demands that we put out there, Matt. We believe that it can be done, and many of them at no cost when you talk about taking away the health insurance for new teachers coming in once they retire. We talk about Medicaid expansion that's actually going to be bringing in dollars. Master's degree pay is not a huge tax on the budget. And the fight for 15 for our lowest paid employees, that was done last year for the other state employees. It needs to be done now for our public school employees. They have the resources, they can do it. When we're sending $150 million over a 10-year plan to private voucher schools that are unaccountable.
Right. Mark, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll come. I think we'll probably bring our cameras down again and talk to some of the teachers. So
we hope to see you there. It's going to be a great day for public education.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely.
After a brief commercial break, we're going to be back to talk with 2 leading journalists to discuss the planned march and more. But before we go to break, see if you can answer this question. True or false? By state law, all charter school teachers must be licensed and certified to teach in North Carolina.
Education Matters is brought to you each week in part by Paragon Bank, serving others, enriching lives.
Just look at me and... Welcome back to Education Matters. Did you correctly answer false? Current state law only requires that 50% of charter school teachers to be licensed in North Carolina. We're going to continue our discussion about the teacher march and other education news happenings with 2 of the best reporters in the business. We have Kelly Hinchcliffe, she is the education reporter for WRAL News, and Jeff Tabiri, who is the Capitol Bureau Chief for WUNC Radio. So thank you both for coming back on the show. It's always good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, obviously, I want to talk a little bit about the teacher march. Kelly, you've covered it. You've covered some of the reaction. I guess just sort of give me your, you were here last year too for the march. Sort of give me a little bit of take on, some of the rhetoric and the issues and sort of what's the same, what's changed.
I can tell you the #1 question I get about the march this year is, will it be bigger than last year? And of course, we don't know yet, but one of the things that we can compare are the number of school districts that are closing. We know last year, 42 out of the state's 115 school districts closed. So far, we have more than a dozen that have closed, but there's still time. A lot can change. Some school districts last year decided to close closer to the actual date of the march or the rally. So it'd be interesting to see, but the rhetoric has certainly ramped up this year, I believe. Yeah. Yeah,
and Jeff, you're down at the legislature a lot. Is the I don't know. Is the tenor, the tone different about the? I mean, I don't know. From my own observation, it seems a little more pointed, but maybe not.
In terms of the rhetoric,
yeah.
I think the rhetoric is certainly more pointed. We've seen in a number of the addresses from Phil Berger's office, from the press releases. I mean, they have framed the NCAE as a left-wing organization. I think they're trying to discredit them before this event even takes place, right? It's not an election year, so I wonder, how, if at all, that will factor into this. As Kelly mentioned, we have a number of school closings, not as many yet as last year, but some of the biggest districts in the state. And I also do wonder about the role that Reverend William Barber may or may not play in this. He is now going to be permitted to be back in the building. He's been involved in a number of protests, and he's been banned from the building for a while, but that ban just recently this week was lifted. He tends to attract bigger crowds.
Right.
So what role does he play here? And I guess, hopefully not too voyeuristically, but I'm wondering if we're going to see arrests this year. Full disclosure, I was on paternity leave last year, and I was not at the rally, but I don't believe there were any arrests. So I'm interested to see if, I mean, to your question about tone and tenor, if on May 1st there is a different tone or tenor, either in full or in part.
Right. Well, Kelly, the issues that Mark Jewell just talked about, I mean, some of these are similar. I mean, and there's some action around, in fact, I mean, like, for example, Medicaid expansion. I mean, there was just a press conference, and Jeff can weigh in on this too. I mean, there was literally just a press conference, Republican press conference. Don't call it Medicaid expansion, but that's really what it was, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I tell you what, it's been interesting seeing from the different sides who have been talking about this rally. We've even seen from the state superintendent, Mark Johnson, who has come out, pretty forcefully this year, and basically he's pleading with teachers not to go to this rally. He's especially concerned when you look at schools that were affected by the hurricane and how much school those students lost, and he's saying that you need to keep kids in school. So it's been interesting to kind of see how people have been responding to this.
All right, well, let me ask you, that this is obviously connected to funding. I mean, this is certainly part of
course,
it. I mean, it's a big part of it, salaries, school resources. We are maybe 2-3 weeks away from the House unveiling a budget. You've been following this for years, how this whole process works. So they'll unveil those first. So I guess first, what do you think this is sort of what is that going to look like? And then I did want to ask you, as I mentioned before we started taping this, some things have changed about what happens whether this budget gets vetoed or not.
So to me, one of the interesting dynamics, potentially for the very day of May 1st, is going to be the inside-outside dynamic. And I think that it is quite possible you're going to have thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of educators and education supporters outside the building, some inside the building. And we might also be at a key moment in House budget deliberations. It might be before the full House Appropriations Committee that day. The House budget could be on the floor that day. So that's kind of an interesting
Right, the Speaker Moore has
moment.
said, I mean, they've said the end of April, right? Early May at the latest.
And so it could be that day. I mean, and that would make for some interesting challenges for us reporters in terms of how do you cover both of those? How do you weave those two together? Because of course, inherently they are connected. So I guess I'm looking for the timing of that on the House budget side. And in terms of the change that's in place in 2019 in relation to recent years, if lawmakers do not reach a budget deal by July 1st, there is a state law, a relatively new, last couple of years, state law that has been enacted so that if there's no budget, the previous spending levels merely simply continue.
So let me, because that's something that I've been hearing people saying. Well, the governor, there's no supermajority. The governor can veto the budget, so they'll have to work together. What I'm hearing is that no. I mean, actually, the governor could veto it. They could not reach a deal, and it will just revert back to last year's, almost like in D.C. terms, like a continuing resolution.
Right, but they don't even have to pass the continuing resolution.
It just happens.
And this might be a little bit extreme, but to take it to the other end of it, they don't have to pass a budget for a year or 2 years. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. We're going to have some sort of stalemate. We saw this in 2015.
Well, the Republicans have priorities too that they want to get in there, so it's probably not. But it is something I think is interesting to watch.
Right.
All right, Kelly, I want to get to you. You were a central figure in a press conference a couple of weeks ago. I thought Superintendent Mark Johnson rolled out a proposal, which I think initially people thought it's for $400 for teachers to buy supplies for their own classroom, but it kind of became a little more controversial when the last year's North Carolina Teacher of the Year was advertised and then wasn't there. So tell me a little bit about that.
So we went to the press conference, and it was advertised, as you mentioned, that the Teacher of the Year, Lisa Godwin, would be there, and she was noticeably absent. And so I asked the superintendent, why is she not here? And, do you think that she supports this, what you guys are presenting? And he was under the impression that she did support it. And when I spoke with her later, she basically said that she would have supported it if she felt like this was money above and beyond, but she understood this to be a reallocation of money. Basically, the plan is to give every teacher $400 so they can buy school supplies instead of routing that money through the boards of education to decide.
Right. So what else are you chasing right now? You mentioned something about some changes with substitute teachers.
Yeah, interesting story about substitute teachers in North Carolina. I learned something new, that they are not regulated at all by the state, that each local school district has the ability to decide how they want to hire them, what certifications, or not certifications, but what, think of the word.
The credentials,
Thank you, what
There
credentials they would have. And part of doing that reporting, I found out that in Wake County, you did not have to have a high school diploma. So in essence, you could be substitute teaching students who may have more education than you do. And so we reported that story, and Wake County has since said that they're going to add that back in. Beginning next school year, substitutes will have to have a high school diploma.
Well, I want to wrap up with you, Jeff. I guess same question. What are you chasing? What are you watching for? Like any markers in the budget or certain bills?
The big one, of course, is how much additional money is set aside for teachers and salaries. And I think one of the points of rhetoric we've heard frequently from education supporters is that pre-recession spending levels, we're not back up to pre-recession spending levels when adjusted for inflation. So is that, it's a little wonky, right? But is that something that's going to be achieved later this year?
Right. Any other hot votes coming up? A couple of things came up around sort of virtual preschool yesterday, but anything else?
I'm interested to see what happens with broadband in rural counties. I think that's on the periphery to an extent, but that is a pretty important issue for K-12 and learning, I think.
Great. Well, look, thank you both for being here. We'll have you back on. Maybe we'll have to, after the March and sort of after the budgets, I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about some of these issues. But thank you for what you do and for keeping us informed and for coming on the show. So thanks so much, both.
Thank you.
After the break, this week's final word. The rhetoric around the planned May 1 teacher rally, as we talked about on the show, has escalated quickly. Republican Senate Leader Phil Berger slammed NCAE as a far-left group that doesn't care about helping teachers. Conservative groups such as Civitas went further, asking whether the march has Marxist roots and that May the 1st was selected since it's a known communist holiday. Now, come on, people. State Superintendent Mark Johnson, for his part, has mostly focused on the disruption for parents and loss of instructional time, suggesting teachers pick another day when school is already out. An extra day off can certainly mean some inconvenience for some parents and lost hours for students. But from where I sit, students are losing a lot more than just one day of instruction when our state chooses to disinvest in their classrooms every day. And protests, are supposed to disrupt and get attention. That's why we see them at major sporting events. It's why the lunch counter protests happen during lunch and not after hours where they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. Protests really are as old as America itself. The teachers I met last year when we took our cameras to the rally were visibly upset when they told story after story about how they were not able to provide everything their students needed due to lack of resources. Now, they didn't seem like Marxists to me. What they seemed like were teachers who cared, and they deserved to be heard. Now that's it for this week's show. Now next week is our special 100th episode of Education Matters. We're going to be recording it, a very special show here in front of a studio audience. We have a great lineup of guests. We're going to talk about some pretty serious stuff about how we keep our children safe, a frank and informative discussion about issues such as increased mental illness and anxiety, peer pressure, mental health, self-harm, and unfortunately, suicide. You will not want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.